The broadcast is now starting. All attendees are in listen-only mode.
Hi, good afternoon, everyone, and welcome. My name is Aubrey McLaughlin. I'm the Director of Alumni Professional Networks for the University of Maryland's Alumni Association. We're excited you're able to join us for today's webinar, An Overview of Terrorism in 2017, presented by Dr. Erin Miller. This webinar is part of the Alumni Association's Professional Development webinar series, in which we hope to provide thought-provoking and valuable content that will help alumni like you achieve your personal and professional goals. We have a lot of information to cover today, but we'll be taking questions throughout the presentation. Please feel free to submit any questions you have at any time using the question box located in the GoToWebinar control panel. Erin Miller manages the Global Terrorism Database at the National Consortium for the Study of Terrorism and Responses to Terrorism, based at the University of Maryland. Erin earned a bachelor's in sociology from the University of Pennsylvania and a master's and PhD in criminology and criminal justice from the University of Maryland. She has been a part of the Global Terrorism Database project team since 2004. Her role includes developing efficient and effective data collection strategies and producing accessible analysis that provides context for current events in terrorism and counterterrorism. Erin is a co-principal investigator for the Statistical Annex data collection and analysis for the U.S. State Department's country reports on terrorism. She has served as a principal investigator on several START research projects that relate to the Global Terrorism Database, including the Terrorism and Extremist Violence in the United States platform, the Profiles of Perpetrators of Terrorism in the United States database, and the Program to Prepare Communities for Complex Coordinated Terrorist Attacks. And now we will get started. Erin, take it away.
Thanks, Aubrey, and thanks to those of you for joining us and taking some time out of your day. I appreciate your interest in this topic. As Aubrey said, I'm going to be giving an overview of terrorism in 2017 based on our new data that we just released a few weeks ago from the Global Terrorism Database. My goal, though, is to give you some background on the GTD and let you know how we collect the data. One of our priorities is always transparency, given the sensitivity of the topic, and we are often engaged in explaining to interested parties and users and security professionals how we actually collect the data so that it's clear what the implications of that are for analysis. So I'm going to spend a little bit of time on that and then give just a broad overview of some of the trends that we have seen in the new data that we completed for 2017. As Aubrey said, if you have any questions, I'm happy to take them throughout, and no need to wait until the end to ask questions. If you have any confusion or questions about something I mentioned, I'll stop periodically and check in to see if there's anything I can explain more thoroughly. So to give some background on the database itself, the GTD is an open source database that includes information on both domestic and international terrorist attacks that have occurred around the world since 1970. As you know, we just updated the data through 2017. We typically release a year of data at a time, and now we're up to 180,000 records of terrorist attacks that have happened around the world since 1970. The information that we have in the GTD has been something that START, the National Consortium for the Study of Terrorism and Responses to Terrorism, based at the University of Maryland. We've been working on that since about 2001, and I'll give you some background on the history of the data collection project and how it came to arrive at the University of Maryland. This is how the original data collection took place. We actually inherited a whole set of hard copies of records that were originally collected by the Pinkerton Global Intelligence Service, PGIS, where they documented the details of terrorist attacks by hand on index cards that are stored in these archival boxes that you see here in the image on the screen. The sources that they used were all open source, unclassified information from the media, including newspapers and newswires, radio and TV transcripts. We've supplemented that data from the original PGIS records with information from terrorism chronologies and older State Department reports. The information in these storage boxes covered events that took place between 1970 and 1997, and so we got a hold of these records in 2001 and started digitizing them, and since then we've extended the data collection. I'll tell you a little bit more about our current methods for data collection, that we rely much more heavily on internet sources, internet media sources, and all of the vagaries that go along with open source research from online sources. These are just some images of a few of the original cards that were in those storage boxes that were collected by the Pinkerton group. The first one is an attack from 1979 that took place on the 21st of April. You can see how terrible the handwriting is. It was quite an endeavor to digitize all of the information on these cards as clearly as possible. This is an attack in Northern Ireland. It involved the target was a train, and you can see line 5 there says explode, so indicating that there was an explosion. Line 8 indicates that the perpetrator was the IRA, and we have a guide for what each of the rows on what each of the entries on these cards represented, so that the original data collectors didn't have to spell everything out. But there's still a bit of ambiguity. You can see a note here on this card. It says stopped train just after it crossed the border from the Irish Republic. 2 charges in milk churns placed in an engine. Railroad bridge blocked with 4 hijacked trucks. Exploded and buckled the main line between Belfast and Dublin. And then there's a note there that says the source is Reuters from the 21st of April, 1979. And so there's not a great deal of detail on these cards, but we took a lot of effort to digitize that information and put it into a database that analysts could use. The second card here is the card for the 1995 Oklahoma City attack. You can see the details that are there are a bit sparse. The original group, perpetrator group, was recorded as right-wing extremists, question mark, question mark. The sources were from the early days, for the most part, right after the attack took place, and so you can imagine how, as information unfolds in the wake of an attack, it can be difficult to make sure that we have updated details for both casualties and perpetrator information in particular. The current GTD collection strategy is a bit more sophisticated. We have what we call a hybrid strategy for collecting the data, which leverages both automated technologies and human analysis. And we find that it's important to do this because automated technologies are good at certain things and not good at other things, and humans are good at certain things and not good at other things. And the main advantage to leveraging automated strategies is that computers are effective at reading far more quickly than humans are, and so because of the vastness and the growth of accessible media information from around the world, we're able to start with a pool, an initial pool of articles, of news articles that come from thousands of sources around the world and generate about 2 million articles per day. So that's obviously a vast amount of content that no human would be able to read on their own. We use a number of strategies, including just basic filters to start off with, as well as natural language processing and machine learning techniques to whittle that pool down to the articles that are most likely to have information about terrorist attacks, the information that we're interested in. Some of our strategies operate somewhat like a spam filter would on your email, where you're classifying news articles instead of into spam and not spam in terms of your email, but you're classifying news articles into relevant and not relevant articles. And our analysts are able to assess how much relevant information or whether there's relevant information in those articles, and that trains the machine learning model to give us more refined results and show the analysts the articles that are likely to have information about terrorist attacks and exclude those that are not likely to have information about terrorist attacks. So after we use some initial searches and apply the results of the machine learning model, our staff has about 14,000. It varies quite a lot from month to month, but on average about 14,000 news articles every month to review, to go through in a process we call triaging, to try and identify information about terrorist attacks in those news articles. Once those attacks are identified, we have a staff and students who go through all of the information that we have about those attacks and record as much information as possible. The structured Global Terrorism Database includes more than 120 different variables, and we try and get as much detail as possible. It's a bit more than the original PGIS collectors were able to fit on those index cards in the 1970s and 80s and 90s. Before I go on to how we define terrorism, if anyone has any questions about the techniques that we use to collect the data, I'm happy to take any questions on that before we get into the thorny issues of defining terrorism. Just take a moment.
And while you're, if you are typing in questions, I'll give you an extra minute here. I just want to point out that we do have 2 handouts as well for you to take back with you. One is an overview on the START, which is at the University of Maryland, and the other one was actually an article that was posted this morning, and Erin can maybe talk a little bit more about that. But it's a fascinating article just about terrorism, and she's featured in it as well. So I don't believe we have any questions at this time, Erin.
Sounds good. Thanks, Aubrey.
Sure.
So one of the most important questions that we often get is how do we define terrorism? So how do we decide what is included in the database and what is not included in the database? This on your screen right now is the GTD definition of terrorism. This is a definition that we inherited from the original PGIS data collectors, and it is acts by non-state actors involving the threatened or actual use of illegal force or violence to attain a political, economic, religious, or social goal through fear, coercion, or intimidation. There's a few interesting things about this particular definition. In some ways, it is less broad than it could be. It does not include, for example, acts of violence by state actors, and by that I mean attacks by military or police. In other ways, it is somewhat broader than it could be, and many definitions, for example, definitions of terrorism, for example, require that an attack target civilians, target non-combatants. This definition that we inherited from PGIS does not require that the attack target civilians. It's actually most aligned, and you may know that the world and even the U.S. federal government have many different definitions of terrorism. This one's actually most aligned, we think, with the United States Department of Defense definition of terrorism, and we think that that is likely to be the case because many of the original PGIS data collectors were actually retired Air Force personnel. And so in some ways it's a more narrow definition than it could be. In some ways it's a broader definition than it could be. In general, one of the goals that we have with the Global Terrorism Database is that because we make this data available to the public, we really want it to be as useful as possible to as many different users as possible. And the definition of terrorism that is most appropriate depends less on your personal beliefs and more on your analytical questions and what kind of information you're trying to learn about and what kinds of conclusions you're trying to learn about. So what we've done at START, this is, like I said, this is the original PGIS definition of terrorism. As we have extended the GTD collection beyond 1997, we've also structured this definition a little bit more. And so the next slide, which I'm afraid has far more words than it is really acceptable, this is what our work to sort of parse out the different parts of that definition. And we've done so by establishing what we call mandatory inclusion criteria, One is that the incident must be intentional. 2 is that it must entail some level of violence. And 3 is that there must be subnational perpetrators. All of these must be required for any violent event or for any event to be included in the Global Terrorism Database. And we have an extensive code book that we use to sort of parse these out even further and provide a little bit more specificity and guidelines in terms of how we how we describe things or define things like what qualifies as violence, what qualifies as intentionality, and so on, and so what qualifies as subnational perpetrators, for example. In addition, the other way that we sort of teased apart that original definition is that at least 2 of the next 3 criteria must be met for inclusion in the database, not necessarily all 3. And this just breaks the PGI's definition down into its constituent parts. They include a political, economic, religious, or social goal, some intention to coerce or intimidate a broader audience beyond the immediate victim, so it can't be an interpersonal attack. And then the third is a lengthy way of saying that it must target civilian targets, which, because not all 3 of these are necessarily need to be satisfied for something to be included, may or may not be met for any case in the database. But what we do is, in order to make the data as flexible as possible so that as many different analytical questions can rely on the data, is that we actually provide a lot of information about which of these criteria are met so that users of the data are able to filter in or out cases. If they're interested in a stricter definition, a more narrow definition of terrorism, they can do so. And if they're interested in a broader definition of terrorism, depending on their analytical questions, they can do that as well. The types of information that are included in the Global Terrorism Database you can imagine are about what you would see in a news article. So the fact that we draw all of our information from news articles really dictates the types and amounts of information we're able to glean for the database. So we obviously have the date of the attack, when it happened. We have information on the type of the terrorist attack and the tactics that are used, really. Those are listed there. Our tactic categories are listed on the screen. The location of the attack, we've gotten much more sophisticated in recording information about the location of the attack since the days of the index cards, where there were no latitude and longitudes included on those index cards. But not only have we started collecting geospatial information, we've gone back historically throughout all of the original data and done our best to identify the coordinates of the location of the attacks that have happened in the earlier years of the database. Perpetrator information, whether we have information about the perpetrator group that was involved or any individuals that were involved, what weapons were used, what are the characteristics of the targets, including the type of target and the nationality of the target. We have information about the outcome of the attack in terms of both casualties and injuries, but also if hostages were taken or if a kidnapping occurred, we try as well as we can to record what the outcome of that extended event was. And as much as possible, we try and record any information about the property damage as well. And then finally, we put all of this information on our website. So you can see the URLs there, www.start.umd.edu/GTD. This is what our website looks like. It's open to the public. You can go and search the database, use the interface to browse through events by perpetrator, by location. And we also provide the full data set in an Excel format for users who are interested in doing their own analysis, whether they are researchers or intelligence analysts or journalists, are able to download the full data set and conduct their own analysis. And when I do an overview of the results, hopefully you'll see that there's a real wealth of information there. I'll only be able to scratch the surface in the course of this particular presentation, but there's quite a lot of information that varies quite a lot from place to place, and so it is important for analysts who are interested in a particular topic or a particular region to dig into the data on their own and see what they can learn from it. So global terrorism in 2017, we have, so as I mentioned, we now collect the latitude and longitude for all of the attacks that take place around the world, which allows us to fairly easily visualize the concentrations, the geographic concentrations of terrorism around the world. And it's always been the case that terrorism is fairly geographically concentrated. It has varied over the past decades in terms of where those concentrations of attacks occur. And so in the 1970s and 1980s, terrorism was much more concentrated in Latin America and in Western Europe and the United States to a lesser extent. And now we see that the concentration is much more in the Middle East, in South Asia, in Africa. And so you can see this is just this image just shows the attacks in 2017. We have other images and maps that are that vary a bit more chronologically on our website if you're interested in checking those out and what some of the geographic distributions look like for past years of data collection. But it does sort of give a really quick overview of the lack of uniformity of patterns of terrorism around the world. The most recent data that we just released for 2017 shows that we've seen actually the third year in a row of declining numbers of attacks and deaths around the world. And so the total numbers of attacks and deaths have been declining considerably for the past 3 years. We saw this peak in 2014 that took place with the rise of the Islamic State and the expansion of the Islamic State, where the Islamic State in Iraq and Syria, as well as various affiliated groups that were active in other parts of the world, perhaps most notably Boko Haram in Nigeria, really expanded the number of attacks and particularly the lethality of certain attacks, where we saw a number of attacks in which hundreds, if not thousands, of people were killed. And that led to this global peak in 2014 that was really driven by this particular pattern of Islamic State related terrorism. We have seen declines since then, and you can see that in the graph on your screen now. So it's been fairly steadily declining through 2015, 2016, and 2017, but it is a little bit difficult to explain this pattern to people because it's important, I think, to put it into the broader context. And if I go to the next slide, you can see what the longer term time frame is. So this just shows 2012 to 2017. The next slide shows the data through all the way back to 1970. And so you can see, even though we are seeing this decline, terrorism is still much higher than it was, or that we were seeing in the decades leading up to September 11th, for example. Now, the caveat that is always important to share here is that because the data is based on, because the GTD is based on open source media accounts of terrorist attacks, you have to imagine what impact that would have on our ability to access information. And so the expansion of the internet, the expansion of accessible media, and our ability to process large amounts of media has undoubtedly had an impact on what the resulting data looks like. And so for a long time, in fact, in particular, when we're seeing this increase in attacks, we were concerned that that was driven more by accessibility of media than actual events on the ground. And now that we have seen decreases, we think that threat is somewhat mitigated because the accessibility of information, the accessibility of media has only continued to increase. We're only seeing more and more content that we're able to access and review to find information about terrorist attacks. But we are actually able to capture decreases. And so we often caution that users and viewers take this information with a little bit of caution in terms of interpreting trends over time. Yet it still is important to recognize the difference in the frequency of terrorist attacks in the 21st century compared to in the 20th century. One of the things that I mentioned so far is the importance of digging into the data. And so, like I said, unfortunately, I will only be able to give a broad overview today, but I hope that the overview that I give you starts to illustrate how diverse the patterns and trends are that we see when we really dig into the data. And so this graph that you see on your screen now, this is for terrorist attacks and deaths in 2017, broken down by region, and it shows the change in the number of either attacks or deaths between 2016 and 2017 in particular. And you can see how not only is the concentration of number of attacks really focused on particular areas, and this is not balanced by population at all, so that's important to take into consideration as well. But you can see how the change from 2016 to 2017 really does vary from region to region. And so some of the largest decreases that we've seen took place between 2016 and 2017, took place in the Middle East and North African countries. This is certainly an area where terrorism has been concentrated recently. As I mentioned, the expansion of the Islamic State in this region. And so that decrease, that 38% decrease is tremendously impactful in terms of driving global patterns. And so you can see at the bottom of this table, the worldwide total from 2016 to 2017, we saw a 20% decrease in terms of attacks, and we saw a 24% decrease in terms of total fatalities. And please bear in mind that actually does include perpetrator fatalities as well. And so the pattern that we see for the Middle East and North Africa is important, but it's not necessarily consistent with what we've seen in other locations. So despite these global decreases, there are certain locations, including South America, including Western Europe, including North America as well, that have seen increases during this time period in the number of attacks and in some cases the number of fatalities as well. The caution that I will give you here relates to North America and Western Europe in particular. So in these locations, and I mean South America as well, in these locations that have fewer numbers of terrorist attacks and fewer numbers of fatalities, major attacks can really impact the trends that we see, the aggregate trends that we see, and can be potentially misleading. So you might be interested to know, for example, that the numbers for North America in terms of total attacks and total deaths do actually include the attack that occurred last October in Las Vegas. There was certainly a lot of question about whether or not that attack was ideologically motivated. There was some indication that it may have been, but it is not nearly as explicit as that we often see in many cases. But you can imagine how that decision that we made to ultimately include the Las Vegas attack from October in the database really impacted the trends here. So for example, I believe 59 people total were killed. I think that includes the perpetrator. So that's obviously a very large, almost half of the number of total deaths that occurred in North America. And so while it's important to sort of consider the overall trends, I would argue that it's more important to really be aware of what is driving those patterns and how decisions about the data drive those patterns, and even outside the decisions that we make. The fact that the attacks in these locations, particularly in North America and Western Europe, and in Latin America, are far less likely to have a high number of casualties compared to either other places around the world, or in some cases the historical patterns in these locations. So there was obviously a great deal of highly lethal terrorism in Latin America in particular in the 1970s and 1980s. And so it is important to be aware of how those, particularly outstanding and exceptionally deadly attacks can have an outsized impact on the statistics, on in the way that statistics fail to tell the whole story oftentimes. One of the aspects of data that we collect as much as we can for every attack is what weapons were used in the terrorist attacks that take place. This chart, this pie chart that you see here, is one that I update every year. So this is the breakdown of weapons used in terrorist attacks around the world just in 2017. The other category up there is just 1%, and that includes, in this case, chemical weapons, sabotage weapons, and so that would be, for example, if someone tries to sabotage a rail line, a train line, to derail a train, for example. Vehicle attacks, which have been in the news quite a lot recently, and fake weapons, which are often used in combination with real weapons, but we record them as well anyway. But you can see here that the vast majority of terrorist attacks that we see around the world involve explosives or firearms. So more than half involve explosives, about a third involve firearms. The melee weapons that make up about 5% are often involve hand-to-hand combat, small arms, knives and sharp objects, for example. And then another 8% of attacks worldwide, or excuse me, of weapons worldwide, I should say, because we can see multiple weapons per attack. About 8% of the weapons are incendiary weapons, so arson or Molotov cocktails or so on and so forth. One of the things that is, I think, kind of interesting about this pie chart is that I remake this pie chart every year when we update the new data, and it very rarely changes for the global trends. It's always been about 80 some percent of the attacks or the weapons used are explosives or firearms. What is interesting about it, though, that is hard to get here, is that this pie chart you could make for every different country, and there's quite a lot of variation from place to place in terms of what weapons are used and what are the most commonly used weapons, what are the deadliest weapons. And so it has been interesting to dig into that, and if you're interested in tactics and weapons used in terrorist attacks, I think that the geographic variation is really an interesting topic. Just to sort of, again, scratch the surface on that, one of the tactics, or one of the types of weapons that has been increasingly noted in the media is the use of vehicles as contact weapons. So there have certainly been a number of high-profile attacks that involve this tactic, and by this I mean vehicles that are used to physically drive into the target, as opposed to vehicles that are used in a car bomb situation or a vehicle-borne IED tactic. So these are just the statistics on the use of vehicles as contact weapons. This covers the time period 2012 to 2017. The first attacks that we have seen that did involve vehicles as contact weapons were not recent. They do go back to 1970, but far more rare in the earlier years of the database. And so we do see, if I can just quickly go back to the previous slide, that other category represents 1% of all weapons used, and that includes chemical sabotage and fake weapons as well. So vehicles compared to other types of weapons are exceptionally rare in terms of terrorist attacks worldwide. However, it is not wrong to conclude that the use of vehicles as contact weapons has been increasing, and in particular that the deadliness of these attacks has been increasing. Yet again, this only still scratches the surface of this phenomenon, because there are a number of other considerations that should be made, including things like what other weapons are used in concert with vehicles as contact weapons. And so the lethality of these attacks may be, but is not necessarily directly a result of the use of vehicles as contact weapons. It's possible that the attackers in these cases used vehicles as contact weapons, but also firearms or explosive devices alongside those, and figuring out what the relative impact of those weapons is requires a much more in-depth analysis of the data. We do see, however, though, that most of the attacks involving vehicles as contact weapons have not been particularly deadly, if deadly at all. It's just a pattern where we see a few highly exceptional cases. The Nice attack in France comes to mind, in particular, where the vehicle itself was used as a contact weapon in a particularly lethal result. One of the other aspects of attacks that we have information on is the targets of the attack. And so, as I mentioned, this is certainly of interest to, in particular, to a lot of analysts who are concerned about the sort of narrowness of the definition of terrorism and whether or not the attack targeted civilians. I think one of the first things that you notice when you look at these target type categories that we use is that they're not entirely mutually exclusive. And by that I mean that any particular attack can fall into more than one of these target categories. Our goal when we record the information in the database is to use the most detailed, the most descriptive target category possible. And so for example, if we have information that a target was specifically targeted because it was a journalism target or a religious target, we would prefer those types of more descriptive information over recording those as private citizens and property, even though certainly journalists and religious figures are also private citizens. And so despite the fact that we do try to err on the side of more detailed, more specific identifiers here, we do see routinely that around the world, the most frequently attacked targets in our categories here are private citizens and property. Globally, that is followed by military, although that does, of course, vary quite a lot from place to place. Same with police targets. Police and governments are certainly very consistent with a lot of different ideological persuasions, including general anti-government sentiment, but also anti-police sentiment in particular, and the fact that police are often involved in as targets of terrorism because of circumstantial placement. In fact, the fact that police are sort of ubiquitous in many countries. And so you can see the relative frequency here of the various target types. And this is another example of a pattern that really does vary quite a lot from place to place in terms of where the most frequent targeting strategies are carried out by perpetrator organizations. I just want to note that the other category in this case does include abortion-related targets. I believe there's one of in 2017, airports and aircraft, food and water supply, maritime targets, non-governmental organizations, telecommunications targets, and tourists as well. And then the last sort of slice of the data that I wanted to share with you is the perpetrator organizations that are active in 2017. You can see a few things stand out in this table, I believe. One is the intense concentration of attacks and fatalities that were carried out by the group that's at the top of the list there, Islamic State of Iraq and Levant and ISIL. And so they have carried out the highest number of attacks and been responsible for the highest number of deaths for the past few years. And despite the fact that these numbers have been declining, they were declining from just horrific levels to still horrific, but slightly less horrific levels of violence. And so there's a massive concentration there between Islamic State as well as the Taliban in terms of attacks and deaths, whereas other organizations that are listed here are responsible for, even those that are in the hundreds are far fewer. You can also see a few examples where the organizations change from 2016 to 2017 as blank, which suggests that they are new organizations that have emerged. And it's a striking thing for an organization to emerge and become one of the 20 most active perpetrator groups on the year in the same year. And so going from zero to dozens of attacks is a remarkable thing. In some cases, these are individuals that sort of broke off from other organizations, and so they didn't necessarily pop out of thin air. We do see the two groups in particular that emerged onto this list, directly onto this list in 2017, were JNIM in Mali and GJM in India. The Gorkha Janmukti Morcha group, GJM in India, is noteworthy because despite the fact that it is on this list of the 20 most active perpetrator groups with 70 attacks, it appears that they were only responsible for one death, and so the vast majority of those attacks were non-lethal, which really illustrates something that we see quite a lot in terms of variation from place to place, from context to context, from a perpetrator group to perpetrator group, which is the typical lethality of attacks. And so comparing an organization like Islamic State or an organization like the Taliban, where the ratio of deadliness to frequency is extremely high, and attacks are most typically very lethal, compared to the organizations that are on this list that show the inverse, many of which are active in India, where the frequency of attacks is quite high, but the lethality is quite low. And that's something that we've observed historically throughout the database. There's been just quite a variety in terms of the operational practices of organizations in terms of whether their goals are to disrupt and create property damage, and draw attention to a cause and intimidate and scare people, but without actually causing a lot of casualties, versus the inverse, which we've certainly seen lately with groups that have been active in the past few decades. And so the patterns that we've seen here with these organizations, you can see a number, in addition to the Islamic State listed there at the top, there are a number of other organizations that identify specifically as allies, as affiliates of the Islamic State. Boko Haram is certainly one of them. Boko Haram also goes by the West Africa province of the Islamic State, and there's some infighting there over who is really in charge. of that organization. So Boko Haram and for now, Boko Haram and the West Africa province of the Islamic State are collapsed here into one organization in the database. Also, the Khorasan province of the Islamic State listed there as active in Pakistan and Afghanistan. Sinai province of the Islamic State is active in Egypt. I think that might be the only one that is called out by name, but there are certainly others that have expressed alliances with Islamic State, and a number of other groups that have also had quite a bit of a tug between members who are allied with Islamic State and members who are more allied with Al-Qaeda and its affiliated organizations as well. The last thing I want to mention, that's sort of the overview of the data. If you are interested in more information about the Global Terrorism Database, or if you're interested in more training and information about how the database can be used to answer questions, first I certainly encourage you to check out our website and explore the data on your own. And I also, if you're interested in sort of further instruction about how the database might be useful, we did put together a training that is an online training that is I think about 2 hours long, that walks through a little bit of what I've covered today in terms of the origins of the data collection, but it ties it to the use of Microsoft Excel, and in particular the use of pivot tables in Microsoft Excel, which are a really great tool that we found helpful, particularly with users who are new to data analysis. Obviously, there are many different platforms and tools that one can use to do data analysis, whether it's Stata or SPSS or SAS or R or programmatic tools that can be used to dig into the data and analyze the data. But pivot tables in Excel are a pretty user-friendly tool that we have built into this Global Terrorism Database training. And so if you're interested in that, feel free to go to www.ter.ps/GTD training for more information on that. And with that, I'll take any questions that you have, and thank you again.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Erin. As she mentioned, we'll go ahead and take some time for any questions. As a reminder, please be sure to type your questions into the question box that's located in the GoToWebinar control panel. Just to get started, Erin, a couple of questions here for you. You showed a graph kind of depicting the amount of attacks in particular regions and the change of that over time. Why do you think there's been such a decline in particular regions? I mean, is there something that's happening or changing where people are maybe looking to target other locations, or is there something that you gather from that information specifically?
Sure, that's a great question. So the chart here that we have that breaks down the changes over time is just sort of a first level sort of dive into the regional breakdowns of the data. These variations in increases and decreases persist as you dig down further geographically. So these are regional shifts, which are fairly high level, awkward clumping together of locations. The patterns that we see for country level changes reflect similar patterns from year to year, and so these are not, just as you can't draw conclusions about the global patterns and apply those to everywhere around the world, you cannot even actually draw conclusions about the regional patterns and apply them or draw those conclusions for every country in the region, because there are certainly country level variations. And then within countries, there are sub-country level variations, and the patterns of terrorism within a country is often very concentrated in particular regions of a country. India, for example, is a good example. India has always, I shouldn't say always, but has long been one of the countries that experiences the most terrorist attacks. However, there are certainly large sections vast majority of India that is quite safe and does not experience. So the geographic concentration persists throughout the various levels of geography. The reason for that is very much driven by local context, by contextual patterns and conflicts. And so, for example, we'll see, I don't think we saw this year, but a few years ago we saw a massive spike in the number of attacks in Bangladesh that was not only concentrated in a particular country, but was concentrated, it wasn't even consistent throughout the full year. It was concentrated very specifically around an election that was taking place in Bangladesh that was highly contested, and there was violence surrounding that specific election. And so I can't really stress enough how important it is to pay attention to those things and to really avoid making sort of blanket conclusions, because all of the numbers that I'm showing you here, all of these global and regional patterns are a result of much more specific, much more complex and nuanced local level, regional level conflicts and developments in those conflicts.
Got it. Great, thank you. And then along with that, with the perpetrator groups, I mean, the large ones from 2016 to 2017 seem to be more so declining, but there's some smaller groups that seem to be growing pretty substantially, 130%, 177% on this table specifically.
Right.
Is there like a new rise in certain organizations and groups, or how is that kind of working with this?
That's a really great question. It's a tough one to answer. So in order to answer that, what we would need to do is I would first start drilling down to those groups that you're interested in. This is something that pivot tables are actually really great for, which is why we use them so often. So for example, you mentioned a number of groups. Communist Party of Nepal is one that had a pretty substantial increase. And to be quite honest, I'm sort of I have a general familiarity with most regions of the world, but even I have to sort of look into these things when I see something that stands out like that and say, oh, what was going on in that context? And typically when you look even sometimes just at the summaries of the attacks, so if you focus just on the attacks by those organizations in question and you're saying, what's going on here? You'll get some information about what that was. Perhaps they were all targeting a particular type of target, and that's how we pick up on things like election-related violence, for example. But it may have been involving a particular type of target. It may have been focused on a particular event that people were responding violently to. Sometimes we will see. This isn't represented here necessarily, but we will see some cases where there are retaliatory attacks. So if there's a major attack in Western Europe, for example, perhaps a major Islamic State-inspired attack, we will see a number of retaliatory attacks that increase that number. They're often less lethal, although not necessarily non-lethal. Sometimes they involve arson, and sometimes they're attacks on persons, but they are attacks that are, for example, targeting refugee targets or Muslim targets if people are responding to the perceived threat from Islamists. And so those types of isolated events can sometimes lead to spikes in certain locations.
Great, thank you. And then, I mean, there's so much data that's collected here just year over year. What kind of, I know you mentioned that predictions are really difficult in this space specifically, but what kind of conclusions can you kind of gather or draw that helps kind of maybe not planned for, but maybe like predicts what could be happening in upcoming years, or if there's going to be a rise of something that's going to be happening in the future?
Sure, it is tough. I do typically try and avoid predicting the future, because even with a lot of wonderfully rich data. That's dangerous practice. I do think that this information does allow for analysts to get a sense for what tactics are sort of emerging. One of the things that we often do as we're collecting the data is try and adapt when we see new tactics emerge that we haven't seen previously at scale, and we do as much as we can to capture that information in the database. So one of the big ones historically, looking back, is the use of suicide tactics, right? So when the data collection began in the 1970s, suicide attacks were not a thing that happened. The first suicide attacks were in the early 1980s. And so that wasn't a piece of information that was routinely captured by the data collectors at that time. Obviously, that tactic is certainly of interest now to security analysts and interested parties. And so we, a few years ago, probably more than a few years ago now, we went back historically through all of the data, and we systematically recorded whether or not the attack was a suicide attack to allow that information to be structured and to be used in analysis, so people can compare the attributes and patterns of suicide attacks to the attributes and patterns of non-suicide attacks. More recently, some of the things that we've been paying attention to are during the Iraq War, we saw an increase in the use of what are called sticky bombs, and so we added sticky bombs as a weapon subtype under the explosives category, so that we were able to capture information. Sticky bombs are bombs that are somehow adhesive, whether it's magnetic or literally sticky, to an automobile, to a car, and someone can just sort of drive by on a scooter and attach an explosive device to a car and detonate that. So if we see an increase in a certain type of tactic that may have once been sort of less common, we try and build that information into the database. We're keeping an eye on the use of drones right now, as we haven't added that as a weapon subtype, but we've been wary of sort of increasing reports of individuals using either mainly sort of explosives-laden drones in attacks. So a drone that might have a grenade on it or something like that. We've been trying to be explicit about noting that information, so that that's a pattern that we can sort of see emerging and keep an eye on where that goes, whether that becomes a more widely adopted tactic or not.
Thank you. And then how far down do you drill on bio and chemical weapons? And can you look up events by specific types of weapons?
You can. So you can, on our website, you can filter by the type of weapon, and so you can filter down and just look at attacks that involved biological and chemical weapons. We don't have, I don't believe we have any subtypes for biological weapons. I think we have a few for chemical weapons, and they are, I believe, acid and poisoning. I'm remembering off the top of my head. This is all listed in our code book, by the way, what our categories are. We have actually recently added a category to the chemical weapons that is explosives, which is for when chemicals are attached to explosives. And so you can drill down a little bit in terms of the subtypes for chemical weapons, but in all cases, even if we don't have structured information on the details that were the details of the weapons, for example, that were used, we do have a field in the database that is called weapon details, where the person recording the information will just put as much detail as is possibly reported by the media sources, by the news articles that are covered, that are covering the event. And so they will put the caliber of the weapon, the type of chemical used, the amount of explosive material used, as much information. Unfortunately, for many cases, that's not reported in the media coverage for the event, but whenever it is, we try and grab that detail as much as possible.
Great, thank you. It looks like we have covered all of our questions. Erin, is there anything else you want to just speak to before we wrap up here?
No, that's all, I think, and thanks to everyone who joined, and thanks, Aubrey, for hosting.
Wonderful. Thank you so much. And feel free to contact Erin directly. Her email address is on the screen in front of you. I'll also be sharing a recording of today's webinar with everyone who joined via email, and it will be going on our YouTube channel later today as well. So stay tuned for that. You are able to watch it back for reference or for anything that you may need. But thank you so much, Erin. Thank you, everyone, for joining us today. Have a wonderful day, and go Terps.
Thanks, you too.